Part 6. Philosophy as anti-philosophy. Just as philosophy is capable of examining anything, philosophy is also capable of examining itself. This is the philosophy of philosophy. I believe philosophy to be the only method of intellectual inquiry capable of this circular pattern of investigation. All other methods of inquiry, the set of possible sub-questions, are stifled in this effort by their foundational presupposed axioms, which are a precondition to cognition. This forms a boundary, limiting the exploratory territory of that inquiry. Thus, a sub-question investigating itself provides only a correspondence and equivalence, a unitary intellectual self-congratulation with no possibility for further elaboration. For example, the scientists are a complete void without empiricism and materialism, while traditional religiosity evaporates without metaphysical conviction. Sub-questions are already within their axioms in this regard, and hence cannot challenge themselves by virtue of the existence of a logical immovable, being a presuppositional foundation. On the other hand, the boundless apparatus of philosophy provides a pure logic without supposition. All prospective cards are on the table. This makes all judgments technically possible, while leaving none untouchable by the forces of cognitive destruction. If judgment is cast definitely, cognition then snaps into the bounds of a sub-question, due to the inherently dogmatic nature of any definitive judgment. In contrast, iconoclastic logic bounces endlessly and uncontrollably within cognition, when the philosophical apparatus appraises itself. The inquiry into the meta-question enabled by philosophy places us into a dizzying circular cognition, which instigates a set of ultimate questions of a philosophical nature about philosophy itself. Is philosophy accessible to us? What is the philosophical endgame? Is there a normative method of philosophy? Should we be engaging in philosophical contemplation at all? Are we able to philosophize in the first place? In this self-referential assault, we see the suggestion of anti-philosophy produced by the philosophical apparatus itself. This is a proof of the unique nature of the philosophical inquiry. For example, anti-physics or anti-religion can only arise outside the bounds of their respective sub-questions, and are more often projected as an assault from a rival sub-question. Many schools of philosophy have sidestepped the ultimate philosophical meta-question and instituted their own sub-questions by assuming the virtue or utility of philosophical inquiry in itself, which, being a presupposition of an axiomatic nature, makes their output inherently dogmatic. Through the vain admiration of their own intellect, the enjoyment of never-ending masturbatory conversation and opinion-baiting rhetoric, the majority of what calls itself philosophy has hitherto been a carefully disguised sub-question. The possible eventuality of no riches at the end of the cognitive rainbow has not been acknowledged by the majority of the proponents of what has been named philosophy. With this situation laid bare, I turn to the figure of Philo of Illis and the philosopher David Hume. I consider these examples of possible exceptional figures of iconoclastic philosophy, the connection between both being their inquiry into the circular cognition of philosophically investigating philosophy, which is our greatest hope to occupy and understand the meta-question. In this investigation, I consider them my forebears in the utilization of iconoclastic praxis, which, as I will show you, is a specific notion of skeptical philosophy. To my knowledge, no others have attempted to turn philosophy inside out to the same extent as these two figures. However, it must be admitted that it is questionable if either, by virtue of their humanity, actually achieved the ideal which is the iconoclast. Pyrrhonism. Pyrrhonism is the earliest known thread of philosophical skepticism, derived from the Greek skepikos, meaning inquirer. My study will not revolve around a substantive historical review of Philo, as we have no direct writings of his, but of the archetypal Pyrrhonism as we know it through the lineage of thought in the philosophical zeitgeist. To define the zeitgeist notion of Pyrrhonism as I understand it, I will outline some of its major notions which are relevant to its study, to this study. after which I will move on to relate these to the intellectual economy between iconoclasm and dogmatism. The concepts I will be attempting to explain are the Phaeronian division, equipollence, and circular philosophy. Circular philosophy and the Phaeronian moment. I will then proceed in using these as tools to relate to my core study of the nature of philosophy itself, relating to iconoclastic and dogmatic intellectual activity. These Phaeronian notions contribute to the philosophical state, suspension of judgment. I will show a connection to some of the conclusions of David Hume. This is foundation to my theory of philosophical iconoclasm. These notions, although sparingly directly referenced, share a cognitive paradigm with Hume. Phaeronian division. The Phaeronians categorize philosophers into three different categories. Dogmatists claim to have discovered some kind of ultimate truth. Academics claim knowledge of ultimate truth is impossible. Phaeronians refuse to assert a claim one way or another, continuing their philosophical search. The distinction here between the academics and the Phaeronians isn't obviously clear. The academics subscribe to a sort of truth claim nihilism, whereas the Phaeronians simply continue to philosophize without the equally assertive certainty of either the dogmatists or the academics. This suspension of judgment is cognitive activity the same, but without assuming a necessary axiomatic presupposition. This is a metaphysical agnosticism, not present in either the dogmatists or the academics, who are essentially making metaphysical claims on the ultimate nature of truth. Hence, the Phaeronians are separated from these other categories by virtue of their suspension of definite judgment on the truth question. This is a more sincere philosophy than the academics or dogmatists, as there is insufficient certainty to cast such an all-encompassing logical foundation from which all other cognition must follow. It is in this respect that to suspend judgment is to avoid idealizing a philosophical utopia, built upon a foundational metaphysical insincerity. The Phaeronians are simply making the best of a bad philosophical situation. My definition of the intellectual mode dogmatism fits the dogmatists and the academics equally. In my view, both are making equally assumptive claims on a metaphysical order about the supposed attribute of truth. Technically speaking, this is the case regardless of whether they're making judgments to either the affirmative or to the negative. Metaphysical judgments are presuppositional judgments all the same. The skepticism of the Phaeronians at this stage appears to be iconoclastic in the sense that the journey of philosophy is not being elucidated from within the confines of these dogmatic or academic sub-questions of assumptively absolute or non-existent truth. They are both equally sub-questions due to the nature of their assertive foundations. The metaphysical assertion of absolute relativism under the academic is just as intellectually judgmental as it is under the ultimate truth claim instantiated by the dogmatist. Both imply an intellectual totalitarianism in their respective cognitive economies. The Phaeronians, however, appear to be the only grouping in this division with any claim to be exploring the meta-question of pure and unpresupposed philosophy. The Phaeronian suspension of judgment is a movement towards iconoclastic praxis. This is not to say that the Phaeronian individual might have opinion, inclination, or temperament. However, suspension issues a temperance upon these sub-logical categories of motive. The Phaeronian holds a suspicion that finding a prematurely conclusive answer to the question of truth claims present a threat to sincere philosophizing. Despite their fallible existential instantiation, the genuine philosophical intellect must have a cognitive framework open and without presupposition. The dogmatists and academics of the Phaeronian division, however, have picked sides in this regard and must now philosophize in a manner that is merely combative to defend the honor of their allegiances. This phenomenon is not relegated to these sub-questions. Naturally, cognitive activity with presupposition in any manner appears to evoke the mere squabbling of assertion and rebuttal within the intellectual economy. It appears that debate in this regard often has little to do with any logic of philosophy, and more to do with the emotive nature of cognitive loyalty, defense, and offense. Intellectual notions become as much a part of the ego as any other part of the body. Equipollence. Sextus Empiricus gives us one definition of Pharoneanism as, quote, ability or mental attitude which opposes appearances to judgments in any way whatsoever. This mental attitude results in equipollence of objects and reasons. This ability is the philosophical suspense of all definitive judgment. In this sense, equipollence is important in relation to the various truth claims of the Pharonean division. It's important to reiterate that suspension of judgment is no academic relativism, nor the certainty of any brand of dogmatism, but instead the iconoclastic rejection of all definitive claims. This doesn't result in some nihilistic inactivity of all philosophical actions, but leaves judgment open to constant readjustment. This doesn't result in some nihilistic inactivity of all philosophical actions, but leaves judgment open to constant readjustment, justified by the fact we have insufficient metaphysical evidence for such claims. For the Pharoneans, this suspense is a state of mental rest owing to which we neither affirm or deny anything. The mental attitude resulting from Pharonean suspense is one of unperturbedness or quietude, according to Sextus. Equipollence is no attribute in reality, in opposition to the dogmatic assertion of a truth attribute or the academic assertion of no such attribute. The Pharonean has suspended all undeserved propositional statements in that regard. Equipollence is the honest state of the philosophical subject, or to put it with a direct simplicity, the situation we find ourselves thrown into. It's in this regard that I interpret Pharoneanism as a doctrine of extreme embodiment. The assertions of the dogmatists and academics are equally imagined abstractions of the reality they intellectually desire that the philosophical subject find themselves in. These philosophical dreams contrast with the simple fact that a propositional attribute of truth or untruth cannot be directly observed by the existential subject, whereas equipollence is demonstrable to the infinitely fallible epistemology of the same embodied philosophical subject. Bett summarizes this differential to embodiment and rejection of definitive attributes well. Quote, Thoreau does not simply say that things are indifferent, but that they are equally indifferent. This is not metaphysical indifference by our real natures, but by our sensations and opinions. The main basic principle of the skeptical system is that of opposing to every proposition an equal proposition. Naturally, this must be considered a guiding principle of iconoclastic praxis. To avoid the seduction of definitive judgments, the iconoclast must utilize equipollence as a tool against the validity of projected philosophical judgment. Furthermore, this skeptic formulae, which encompasses the importance of a perpetual no more, encourages honesty in philosophical inquiry. All other cognition is operating from the fumes of preconception, being mere products of human intellectual hubris. I determine nothing, of which the I is the prime mover for skepticism, linking us back to our human predicament as far as equipollence is concerned. The blank fact that is that in terms of the experience of this I, the appearances do not overthrow the affective sense impressions which induce our assent involuntary. This state of affairs concerning the I, the context of which we appear to be stuck within, does not concern the appearance itself, but the account given of that appearance. To relate this duality of voluntary assent and dissent to the study of intellectual economy, all dogmatic thought is that of the opposed. In regards to a positive or negative judgment, this makes their cognitive frames inherently combative, whereas all iconoclastic thought has its basis in the fundamental principle and reality of equipoise. What is fear but worry over the pride of the ego if our judgments prove wrong? Quoting Euripides through Sextus, "Who knows if life be but a state of death, and death be counted life in realms below?" End quote. I think that here Euripides misses the point. Although his statement has the spirit of iconoclastic skepticism, even to assert that there exists realms below implies some nature of death is evident. To assume the eternal eschatological opposite, by nature of the appearance of living, ties us not only to the substantive reality of the conceptual death, but to some embodied existence. This is the reality of skepticism. Each dissension into definitive judgment strengthens the basic iconoclastic argument. Quote, "If any dogmatist should attempt to refute any of our statements, he would be strengthening the skeptical judgment by adding support to suspension of judgment about the matters in question as a result of our mutual antagonism and indeterminable dissension." End quote. This is how the eternal dogmatist plays into the hand of iconoclastic philosophy. The iconoclast is a tormentor in this regard, the facilitator of the continuous overthrow of dogmatic assertions that are past their temporal prime. Iconoclasm attacks these axiomatic arguments, for if they are destroyed, all the rest of the arguments are overthrown as well. Circular philosophy. Philosophy is the only mode of inquiry capable of examining itself with its own apparatus, the only inquiry capable of calling itself into question. All other modes of inquiry lack this open-endedness due to their status as sub-questions. For a mode of inquiry to question its very cognitive foundation, it must be without predetermined axioms. Livingstone puts this succinctly. What is the nature and worth of physics? Is a question about physics, but not a question in physics? Whereas, what is philosophy? Is both a question about philosophy and a question in philosophy? This philosophy of philosophy leads us into what could be described as cognitive recursion, a circular intellectual endeavour with the status of existential intractability. This can only occur when we turn the philosophical apparatus on itself. This process is intractable in the sense that it might end, the realization of a telos might eventually be achieved, but there is no certainty, with no indication that we can estimate any such limit. This gives rise to all manner of self-questioning questions. What is the goal of philosophical inquiry? Can we, as fallible and bounded human beings, carry out genuine philosophical inquiry? Is philosophical inquiry worthwhile or actually harmful? What is the nature of true philosophy? Proof is truth. The nature of the philosophical inquiry appears orientated towards this end. However, any sincere investigation into proof descends into the eternal why. It doesn't matter if you're expounding the truth in an epistemological Gettier problem, or morally asserting the truth of good and evil. This childlike why haunts the existence of those who can and do think. It is impossible to prove an infinite series, and so it is impossible also to get to know that something true exists. The indifferent nature of things, as they are perceived, leaves us fundamentally unable to tell if our opinions are true or false. This leaves us wallowing in the predicament of iconoclasm, yet with a proclivity to cast dogmatic judgment to realize the physicality of our earthly yearnings. The inconsistency of any universal cognition bleeds into our relation with the meta-question, and the loop of cognition is instantiated as the philosophical subject grasps towards what cannot be grasped. Philonianism is a circle of thought, the discovery that philosophy is inconsistent with itself. This open-ended recursive inquiry is our access to the meta-question. Investigating philosophy philosophically is the way to generate thought not bounded by the sub-questions, which are incapable of calling all things into question. Wonders and horrors beyond our comprehension doesn't even cut it. Iconoclasm is inexplicably the greatest saturation of philosophy, but also its greatest void. The Pharonean tradition understands this when it calls philosophy empty. Pharonean moment, philosophy as empty. The tragedy of the Pharonean is they must always speak undogmatically, and so give up hope to any semblance of certainty within or without the boundaries of cognition unequivocally. This is an inhuman way to cognate, which makes the Pharonean, and hence the iconoclastic task, one of inherent de-anthropomorphization. In the wallow of the impossible philosophical ideal, the Pharonean moment occurs. The realization that philosophy itself seems like a fool's game for the embodied subject. Any attempt at an honest philosophical framework built around a sense of knowledge, or what makes a good life, dissolves without the presuppositions of dogmatic thought. The philosophical endeavour becomes a negative burden for the human subject, as it threatens any hope of existential tranquility under the pressure of iconoclastic ultra-skepticism. The hopeful philosopher falls into intellectual melancholy and delirium, a heady mixture of skeptical anguish and iconoclastic intoxicant leaves the meta-question of philosophy empty.